Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part of the portrait series, the Touchdown. I'm Mr. Elon. Remember, this is your chance to get creative, and it is highly suggested that you push it as far as it can go. I may kick it back to you for revision if you only do, one or two things. I want to see I'm not saying you have to use every tool, but I want to see kind of a variety of tools used to create a variety of intentional things. There are some suggestions on the handout. A lot of what you're going to do is use kind of the same tools the same way. Remember in the touch-up video, when I was demonstrating the clone stamp tool, I showed how you could use it to make an extra eye, and I actually did that with this one. So you could begin by just declaring that you want to just make it completely crazy and messed up looking. You could also have a specific thing you're going for, like zombie or Smurf or before plastic surgery shot, or I'm super old, or I just lost a fight, or something like that. That's entirely up to you if you want to be thematic or if you just want to go crazy with it. Either way, again, make sure you push it. There are some suggested tools and processes and suggested possible effects, but once again, you can take this in whatever direction you want, as long as it ends up looking adequate. So you're using the same skills you've used before to touch things up. You don't want it to just look like Microsoft Paint digital garbage. With this video, I am going to show some basic things, maybe kind of along the lines of the examples, and how I did some of that stuff. I'm also going to, toward the end, and this might be a little bit of a longer video, but you can kind of stop it, whenever you get the picture. At the end, I am going to show some ways to kind of take this further, some alternative ways to use tools, and I'll even dabble a little bit in compositing, which is a lot more relevant to the next project. But if you are interested in doing a little of that here, you certainly can. So I am on my original one here. And the first thing I'm going to do, obviously I'm not going to demonstrate this, but, right in the beginning, I guess I will. Right in the beginning, I had demonstrated selecting the iris, and, I'll just go ahead and do that again. Just for quick review, I'm using Shift to add to my selection and Alt to subtract. Once again, I can hit Refine Edge, pull Feather up, and then there's lots of stuff I could do to this. I could go in with brightness contrast and brighten the whole thing so it's frighteningly light. I could go in with color balance and turn it red or yellow or orange or some combination thereof. That is to say that changes in color can be especially effective. Depending on what you want to do, let's say I wanted to give myself a black eye. I might actually make a selection to give myself that black eye. And then I might refine the edge of that selection significantly. Something like that, let's say. I don't want it dipping up into my actual eye. So I might try something like that and then go in with maybe brightness contrast and kind of darken the whole thing. Or add a little hint of blue using color balance. That's to say that you might use Refine Edge and Feather more significantly than you otherwise would if you wanted to look like a change in skin tone. Kind of working my way down the toolbar here. I certainly can use the clone stamp tool to give myself an extra eye like I did before. I'm going to do something interesting with it down here where I use it to intentionally extend. So I'm going to hold Alt and I'm going to click on this tooth. And then remember, when you let go of Alt, it'll kind of show you, so it's almost like it's dragging a copy of that tooth around with it. So let's say I kind of go over here and I intentionally line up with the rest of my mouth. And then I click and hold and color this way, and what you see happening is it's adding more mouth onto my mouth. I could do the same thing the other way. Click here, move over here so it seems like it reasonably lines up, and add even more mouth heading off that way. Now that widens the mouth. If I wanted to reshape the mouth or, otherwise reshape any aspect of this, there's a totally different way that I might do it. And this is one of the new things I'm going to show. So I'm going to go ahead and do the thing I talked about at the very beginning where I make my nose insanely large. I'm going to go ahead and just make kind of since there aren't like hard lines that define the edge of the nose, I'm going to just go ahead and make kind of a crude, quick selection of my nose. I am going to eliminate any shadows dipping in. Excuse me, something like that's probably fine. I'm going to refine the edge and feather it rather significantly. And then I'm going to go... And actually, I'll just go ahead and highlight this. I'm going to highlight in processes, I'm going to highlight edit. So edit mentions fill and stroke, which you're not really going to use here. Those are more relevant to graphic design. But it does mention that it has transform. And if I go, after selecting this, if I go edit and then down to transform. I do have free transform, which will just allow me to like do some basic stuff like make it bigger and rotate it. The one I'm going to use here, which isn't specifically on the sheet, but it's pretty easy to remember. There's this menu that pops out, so distort, perspective. I'm going to try warp. And when I pull warp up, this grid kind of pops up around it. I'm not going to get too much into this, but basically, depending on whether you grab from like the middle of a square, you grab from a node, or there are some secondary nodes that kind of pull off of nodes once you start moving it around. Basically, it allows me to just like reshape this in strange organic ways. So if I grab this over here and start dragging it like that, it is worth noting that since this is all in the same layer, if I pull that back, that looks a little weird, like I'm like revealing my true form underneath or something. The reason for that color is simply because that's my background color, so whatever is in my color selection is going to be there. So I can just pull on it this way and pull on it this way. If it's dipping into my mustache too much, I can kind of pull it up in the center if I want to. And in general, I'm going to kind of move things around. As I distort it and change it, it's going to kind of overwrite parts of itself and like, do things like that. So I want to kind of pull on all of it to make sure I'm eliminating that. When I'm finished, and this is, kind of an important thing that people overlook sometimes, I am going to hit enter. So go ahead and highlight enter on your sheet. Because I clicked away, it didn't do it. So let me do that again. Yeah. So, go like that, under edit, transform, warp, go like that. That looks plenty fine. Okay. Enter, and then Control D to deselect. Now there are some little edges and things that look a little weird, like right up here. So I could just go in with the clone stamp tool, hold Alt, click, and cover over it, or whatever. I'll copy that there. Okay, good enough. Continuing on. There is the smudge tool, and I will warn you that the smudge tool, when you use it, it blurs things. So if I'm using it here, I am blurring things. So it's not always the best idea to use the smudge tool here unless you're going for something, plastic, which you very well could be. But you don't want this to be like redundant from the, step 3. So what I'm going to use the smudge tool for here, and I did something similar to this with, during the step 3 video when I was talking about the smudge tool. I'm going to go ahead and use the smudge tool at full strength. And I'm going to use my bracket key to make the brush size a little bigger. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the hardness up a little bit. We'll see. I'll put it up a little more than halfway. And we'll see if that does what I want it to. And I'm going to grab this and pull. The reason I put the hardness up is so that the edge of this doesn't get too dreamy. And I would even say that it could stand to be a little harder. So I'm going to undo it with my history menu and pull the hardness up a little bit. And I'll lower the size of the brush a little too. I'm going to try it again. Like that. So I'm just giving myself a couple like yucky looking eye stalks kind of shooting out from my face. Now, one thing about those, This one especially looks a little weird because it's like not copying my skin tone. So I might actually back up from that one and try to make this a little bigger. Let's say I have a bigger eye stalk here. That way it at least looks like skin. And this one has that stripe on it too. Well, I don't really mind that. These look okay. They don't quite look, I mean, because I wiggled, there is some sense of form to them, but they don't have much of a sense of light and shadow. And that's kind of the last big tool that I'm going to talk about here. It is, and I'll kind of zoom here, it's actually two tools, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight them. It is the dodge tool and the burn tool. So the dodge tool lightens and the burn tool darkens. The dodge tool looks like a magnifying glass that turned to the dark side, and the burn tool looks like a little hand, like it's kind of covering over part of something. So, dodge and burn will lighten and darken respectively. I'm going to use dodge first. It's worth noting that these have not only exposure, and exposure I would generally put kind of low, like in the, maybe start in the 20s and see what it does. You can always do more. You don't want to put it too high and go overboard too quickly. It also has range. So right now range is on shadows. And if I just kind of run across this whole thing, actually just so you can see what it does, I'll put the strength up really high temporarily. So if I run across this whole thing, you might notice that it's lightening the really it's lightening the really dark things, but it's not doing a lot to the really light things. It's doing a little, it's like making them kind of whiter, and it has kind of a neutral look to it. I'll undo that stuff and change it from shadows to highlights, and as I go across it, it's really nailing those highlights, but it's leaving the really dark stuff alone. And again, it's also getting really colorful. Again, in both cases, the exposure is way too high, and it probably doesn't look very useful. But if I put this on midtones, and especially, and this is again a kind of a follow-up from the plastic thing where you have to think about highlights and shadows. In this case, if I look at the original picture of me, it looks like my key light, my primary light source, was happening more on the left. And there was a secondary fill light over here, but in general, it's going to be a little more shadowy to the right, a little more highlighty to the left, which means if I go on this, and I just go like that, and then maybe that, and then maybe that, and then maybe even a touch of it up top. And then over on this one, if I just kind of like go like this, like the entire left side of it, let that kind of seem like it's catching more of a highlight, especially right there and right there. If I combine that with the burn tool, which works very similarly, it's got exposure and it's got range. It's also got brush size and hardness, so I'll pull the size down significantly. If I go in with the burn tool and I say, all right, right here is going to be a shadow, right here is going to be a shadow. Notice how it just starts like looking way more like it has three-dimensional form to it. Over here I might just be saying right here is a shadow that kind of cuts under there. This shadow is getting a little bright, so sometimes you notice the brightness of the color. That might mean that you want to kind of take it. Oh, I went the wrong way. That might mean that you take it over to highlights or shadows, whichever one gets a little more neutral or a little brighter, whichever it is you need. So once again, the idea is that it looks a lot more authentic than it did before. Now, it's worth noting on my history, if you look at my history right now, it only goes back, like I said, about 20 steps. And right now it's just filled with dodge and burn. So I will say, though, if I do return to the top of it, again, notice it looks just kind of flatter before I did that stuff. I add that stuff in, and it starts just getting kind of like juicy, like there is three-dimensional form that you could reach out and grab. Okay, I am going to show a way to use the dodge and burn tool to make a zit. I'll do it right in the middle of my forehead so it's plain as day. First, let me just say that if I turn on the brush tool and let's say I put it on red, I just want you to notice that this doesn't work. This looks dumb. There are advanced ways to use the brush tool. This is not one of them. So, I will show a way to use the brush tool that you could consider advanced. It's not something you need to use. It's not something I would even highlight at this point. But if you wanted to make zits or measles or whatever, you would be better off doing that with dodge and burn. So here's how you do it. I'm going to go in. I'm going to just keep both of them on midtones probably most of the time. I may change that. We'll see. And I'm going to go into the middle of my head, and I'm going to just go really big at first, and I'm just going to click and just roll around. And I'm trying to get the skin around the zit to look a little irritated. I'm using the bracket key to shrink pretty quickly, and I'm going to get, more and more angry as it hits the center of the pimple. And then finally, I'm going to get real small, and I'm just going to make kind of like a backwards letter C in this case, to make like the, sort of shading around it. With this looking a bit colorful, maybe I switch over to highlights at some point to like bring it back down to earth and get it to be a little more neutral. And then I'm going to go in, and I really only did a few clicks there. I'm going to go in with the dodge tool. I'm going to shrink down to about right here. Let's say here. And maybe start with like a little highlight on that side. And then right in the center of this whole thing, I'm going to click a few times and then shrink a little, click a few times, shrink a little, click a few times, shrink a little, click a few times, shrink a little. The idea here is that I'm making this into like a whitehead that is like ready to go. While I'm still zoomed in and you're still very conscious of the way this was constructed, it might not look like much, but especially if I zoom out, it just starts really looking like this just nightmare zit, or maybe not a nightmare. Maybe that looks fun to bust. Yours does not have to look like this. Again, it's your chance to get creative. You could be coloring the skin crazy, wild colors. You could be using the clone stamp tool to give yourself a bald spot, or just making yourself bald. There are a couple things I'm going to show that you might want to use, but I would say that from this point on, anything else I'm going to do is going to be considered advanced. If you're watching this video and you feel like you got enough out of these tools, you might be able to even like tackle this part of the project without really watching this video. It's just kind of meant to show a couple extra tools and a couple different ways of using the ones you've already used. But you may be able to figure that out on your own, or you might have some ingenious other alternative ways of messing with that. So I'm going to show just a few more things. The first I'm going to show is I'm going to show how to select something and copy it. So you might think, well, copying is what the clone stamp tool does. If I wanted an extra mouth up here, I would just clone stamp it. But clone stamp is going to kind of lock you into the same direction and the same shape as everything else. I'm just going to do something totally left field. I'm going to make a selection of my chin. And with that selected, I am going to hit Refine Edge. I'm going to feather it. And I'm going to hit OK. And at this point, I'm going to go Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste. And interestingly enough, it doesn't look like anything happened until you look over here at the layer menu, which again, this is very much something we're going to study on the next project. On the layer menu, I have the background layer, which is me, but then I have layer 1 with this little tiny ball of flesh, and actually what that is my extra chin. If I use the move tool is at the top of the toolbar. It's going to be super important on the next project. But if I use the move tool while I'm on layer 1, I can grab this extra chin and I can move it around, move it wherever I want. So if I want a double chin, a triple chin, or whatever, I might work with it this way. I can even right-click on layer 1, which is my chin layer, and duplicate the layer. Hit OK. And then let's say I go to the lower one. Now I'm getting into the layer menu here, and again, this is more for the next project. But if I take layer 1 and drop it down to here, and then, I could just keep duplicating and adding extra chins over and over and over again. Now, with this chin kind of lowered down, it doesn't really connect to anything. So for that, I might go Edit, Transform, Warp, and I might just kind of pull on it until it, stretches up that way. So I've got a nice double chin going on. I might also think about just using warp to just change the shape of this in general a little bit so it doesn't look like an exact copy of the other thing. Whoops. Alternatively, I could take this whole thing and I could just move it way up here. And I can go edit, free transform. We talked about transform earlier, but free transform will let me make things bigger or smaller without warping, and it will also let me rotate. So if I wanted to, I could put this here. Maybe I can right click and do warp, and maybe I do reshape it at that point, and maybe I make this like really weird buzzy haircut. I would probably want to contend with that right there a little bit. Maybe I go, there's probably, yeah, I can just keep messing with the shape of it until it fills that space. Something like that. All right, and then I hit enter. And I do have a weird seam here, which is where I might use the eraser tool. That's a weird eraser tool. Let me change that. So the eraser tool erases, hence the name. You'll use it a lot on the next project. It has brush size and hardness just like other similar tools, and I can use it to kind of clean up the edge where you're seeing some of my neck skin. And then I can also use it to just kind of like fade the edge right here a little more. So I have a really scary looking top of my head now. So that involved the layer menu, and it is worth noting. If, for instance, I at this point decide I want to widen my mouth even more, and I go in with my clone stamp tool and hold Alt and click right here, and then move over here. Okay, so actually, yeah, right now Align Sample is on all layers. Normally, it'll just be current layer. So the point that I'm getting at is I can't clone stamp right here if the tool is set the way it normally is. So that's why I have to be very mindful when I start using layers. I have to be mindful of the layer menu. I can only affect the layer that's currently highlighted, meaning if there is no mouth in layer 1 or layer 1 copy, then I can't mess with the mouth when I have that layer highlighted. I have to go to this layer to be able to manipulate it. All right, I'll show two more things. One of them is the brush tool. I mentioned that the brush tool is relatively off limits to you. It's not necessarily. You could use it similarly to the way I gave myself a black eye earlier on, in the sense that if I change the opacity of the brush tool, opacity is the opposite of transparency, and if I take the opacity down, instead of my red being solid, I now have a red that kind of melds with the details underneath it. And also with the opacity down, I can let that sort of stack and get, redder and redder. Now I'm using a really bright red and the opacity isn't down super low. So it's always better to kind of start more subtly and let things build. And in this case, I'm actually going to kind of go for a darker red if I want my nose to just kind of look red and irritated or, rashy. I might just build this up in kind of a painterly way. And there you have it. Maybe I'll do a little more down here too. Yeah. Oh, no, I forgot. That's a separate layer. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. All right. So you could use this to give yourself Kool-Aid mouth. This could be an alternative way to do a black eye. There are a lot of other things you could do with it. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to show, and again, this is very much more relevant to the next project, not something you have to do with this. But the next thing I'm going to show is how to incorporate an asset from something else. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Google Chrome, and I'm going to go to Google Images, and I'm going to type scar. No, I don't want a gun. I want like a facial scar, I'll put scar skin. All right. I don't want anything too gruesome. This looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to copy this image. Now, this isn't the way I would normally recommend messing with assets. Normally I would save the asset. In this case, I'm just doing something simple. So I copied the image and I'm going to go edit, paste. And you might notice right off the bat that this skin tone doesn't match. But I'm going to zoom in here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the eraser. It's worth noting that this came in as layer 2. In other words, when you copy it in, it becomes its own layer. I'm going to go in with the eraser with a really hazy edge, and I'm just going to kind of erase around the scar. I definitely don't want any of this rectangle stuff. And although I can color match the skin a lot better, I don't really necessarily need it. There could be dozens of uses for an asset like this. I could use it I could replace my mouth with it if I wanted to. I'm just going to kind of stick it in my forehead just for good measure. Something like that. And a lot of the time you might find or intentionally seek an asset that's going to relatively, match relatively well. This looks very neutral and pink compared to the orangishness that has happened on me. So what I'm going to do while I'm on this layer is I'm going to go Image, Adjustments, Color Balance, and I'm just going to kind of tinker with it a little bit. If I add some red and maybe a little bit of yellow, it's going to look a lot more like it's fitting in with the area around it. There are other ways to blend, but we'll kind of stop there and keep it simple. At any rate, I have yet another touchdown version of myself. There are a lot of different directions to go and a lot of ways to be creative. Ultimately, the purpose of this last part of the portrait series is exactly that. I personally don't think that any art project is that interesting if it's just everyone doing the same thing. So anytime we're going to spend more than a day on something, I make sure there is some degree of creative input. Good luck. Let me know what kind of help you need, and I'll see you in class.